In the autumn of 1982, beloved history teacher Claire Bennett vanished during a high school field trip to a remote state park, leaving behind only unanswered questions and a fractured community. 17 years later, hikers exploring a hidden cave stumble upon her long-lost camera, its water-damaged film revealing haunting images from the day she disappeared and a shadowy figure that would reopen an investigation thought buried forever. The air was cool and sharp the morning Emily Bennett first heard the news. She had been sipping her coffee in the small kitchen of her apartment when the radio newscaster's calm voice broke through the soft hum of her thoughts. Two hikers had discovered something deep inside a cave at Pine Hollow State Park, a place Emily had avoided for most of her adult life. The item, found partially buried in damp silt and wrapped in a tangle of faded fabric, was a camera. Not just any camera, but one from the early 1980s, corroded and mud-caked, its lens cracked but intact. The hikers had turned it over to authorities, who were now working to preserve the film. No one had said yet whose camera it might be, but Emily felt the weight of the possibility settle heavily in her chest. She knew that park, knew its winding trails and sudden drop-offs, and knew the story that had haunted her family for nearly 2 decades. In the autumn of 1982, her aunt, Claire Bennett, a history teacher loved by students for her adventurous spirit, had vanished there while leading a field trip. Emily had been only a child then, too young to understand the details, but old enough to remember the tears in her mother's eyes and the silence that followed whenever Claire's name came up. The search had gone on for weeks, but no trace of her aunt had been found, save for her backpack abandoned on a narrow trail. It had been the kind of mystery that bred endless rumors, each one twisting the truth a little more until it was impossible to tell where fact ended and fiction began. Now, with the mention of a camera found in a cave no one had known about, something inside Emily stirred. She thought about the stories of Claire's habit of documenting every trip she took, her fondness for photographing both the landscape and her students. If this camera was hers, what might be trapped in those frames? A clue to her final moments? A misstep frozen in time? Or perhaps a face no one had expected to see? She set her coffee down, the steam curling upward and disappearing into the morning light. For the first time in years, Emily felt a pull toward Pine Hollow, the place where her family's questions had begun. And maybe, just maybe, where some of them might finally be answered. By the afternoon, the local news stations had picked up the story, flashing grainy photographs of the cave entrance taken by the hikers who had stumbled across it. The narrow opening was partially hidden by a curtain of moss and roots, the kind of place most people would walk past without a second glance. Emily sat on her couch, watching the looping footage, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Every new detail seemed to pull her deeper into a memory she had tried to keep at arm's length for years. She remembered the day her aunt disappeared with striking clarity. Claire had been leading 20 students from Jefferson High on a field trip to explore the park's limestone formations. It had been a crisp October morning, the leaves blazing in shades of gold and red. The group was due back at the buses by 3 o'clock, but Claire never returned from a short walk she had taken alone to scout a side trail. By the time anyone realized she was missing, the sun was dipping low and the temperature had begun to fall. The search that followed became the largest Pine Hollow had ever seen. Rangers, volunteers, and even the National Guard scoured the park for days. Helicopters buzzed overhead while dogs combed the trails, but the forest kept its secrets. The only clue was her backpack, found propped against a tree at the edge of a ravine. Inside were maps, a thermos of tea, and her wallet. The absence of her camera had puzzled everyone at the time, as Claire rarely went anywhere without it. Now, 17 years later, Emily could not shake the thought that this might be the very same camera found in that hidden cave. If so, it had survived years of damp, cold, and darkness, waiting for the right moment to surface. She thought about the film, the images that might be revealed once the delicate reels were coaxed back to life. The police were not releasing much, only that the camera was being handled by specialists. Still, Emily could feel a shift in the air, a sense that something long dormant was waking up. She did not yet know it, but this discovery was about to pull her into the heart of a mystery she had spent most of her life trying to forget. The next morning, Emily drove to the police station in Pine Hollow, the same brick building she had visited as a child when her mother came to answer questions about Claire. The years had weathered its exterior, but the air inside still carried that faint mix of paper, dust, and strong coffee. She was greeted by Detective Harris, a man in his late 50s whose name she vaguely remembered from news reports in the 80s. His hair had gone gray, and there was a cautiousness in his eyes, as though time had taught him not to get swept away by sudden leads. He led her into a small interview room, explaining that they were still in the early stages of analyzing the camera. It had been confirmed as a model sold in the late 70s, and initial cleaning had revealed faint etching of initials on its bottom plate. CB Emily's breath caught. She didn't need to be told whose initials those were. Harris leaned back in his chair and studied her. He said the camera had been wrapped in what appeared to be part of a jacket, the fabric so degraded it would have to be tested carefully. The fact that it had been found deep inside a cave puzzled him. That cave had never been marked on any maps from the time of Claire's disappearance. It wasn't on public hiking routes, and reaching it required navigating an unmarked ridge and a near vertical drop. Emily asked if the film could be developed, but Harris explained it was a delicate process. The rolls inside were water-damaged and brittle, but specialists were attempting to salvage whatever they could. He warned her that time and moisture may have erased most of the images. Still, Emily felt a stubborn flicker of hope. Before she left, Harris told her something he probably should not have shared. One of the hikers claimed that just inside the cave, near where the camera was found, there had been a small pile of stones arranged in a neat circle. It could have been nothing, but the detail gnawed at her. Claire had once told her that stone circles were like signatures, markers left by travelers to say, "I was here." Driving away from the station, Emily realized she was gripping the steering wheel too tightly. For the first time in 17 years, the story of her aunt's disappearance no longer felt like a closed book. It felt like a door, creaking open. That evening, Emily sat at her kitchen table with a box of old photographs spread out before her. The edges were curled, the colors faded to that familiar vintage warmth that came with time. She sifted through them slowly, searching for something she could not quite name. There were snapshots of birthday parties, summers at the lake, and holiday dinners, but her attention kept drifting to the ones Claire had taken herself. Claire had an eye for framing a moment, catching the small, unguarded gestures that made people look like themselves. One photograph stopped her cold. It was from the morning of the field trip. Claire stood beside the school bus, a thermos in one hand, and her camera strap slung diagonally across her chest. She was smiling at someone out of frame, the kind of smile that felt entirely real. Emily traced the strap with her fingertip, following it down to where the camera rested, just at Claire's hip. Even in the faded image, the initials could be seen faintly etched into the metal body. It was the same camera. She flipped the photo over and found Claire's handwriting in blue ink. "Off to Pine Hollow. The leaves are incredible today." The date matched exactly. Emily stared at the words, hearing her aunt's voice in her head, bright and quick with that unshakable curiosity about the world. Her phone buzzed, breaking her trance. It was Detective Harris. The specialists had managed to extract a partial set of images from the film. They were still in the process of stabilizing them, but one had developed clearly enough to identify its content. He wouldn't say more over the phone, only that she should come in the next morning to see it for herself. Emily hung up and sat in the quiet, the house seeming to press in around her. The idea that Claire's final photographs might still exist felt surreal. For so many years, the details of that day had been a collection of second-hand accounts and unanswered questions. Now there was something tangible, something Claire had seen with her own eyes, preserved across nearly 2 decades in the darkness of a hidden cave. As she gathered the photos back into their box, Emily realized she was no longer simply hoping for answers, she was bracing for them. The next morning, the police station felt colder than Emily remembered. Detective Harris met her in the lobby, his expression steady but lacking the guarded politeness he had shown before. He led her down a narrow hallway to a small room where a projector and a stack of manila folders waited on a table. The blinds were drawn, the air faintly smelling of dust and old coffee. On the wall, a grainy black and white image flickered into focus. It was Claire, captured mid-step, her head turned toward the camera with a faint smile. She was standing on a rocky trail surrounded by tall pines, sunlight slanting through the branches. For a moment, it looked like any photo from a hiking trip until Emily noticed the shadow. It stretched across the bottom corner of the frame, blurred as if whoever it belonged to had been moving. The outline was unmistakably human, but there was something unsettling about it. The proportions seemed off, elongated by the angle, and the figure appeared far closer to Claire than she had likely realized. Harris clicked to the next slide. This one showed the entrance to a cave, dark and irregular, framed by jagged stone. There was no one in the picture, but the camera's focus seemed deliberate, as if Claire had wanted to record exactly where she was headed. Emily's hands tightened in her lap. "These were from the day she vanished?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "They were on the same roll," Harris said. "The cave matches a location in Pine Hollow that was never searched. It's partially submerged most of the year. This may be the first time it's been accessible since then." The idea that this place had existed all along, hidden by water and time, made Emily's chest ache. Claire had been right there, and yet for 17 years no one had known where to look. Harris closed the folder gently. "We're organizing a search of the cave this week. I thought you should see these first." Emily nodded, her voice caught somewhere between hope and dread. She left the station, with the images still burned into her mind, the shadow on the trail following her in thought long after she stepped back into the daylight. The search team assembled at dawn, the sky still holding the pale blush of early light. Emily stood at the edge of the trailhead, her breath clouding in the cool air, watching as divers and searchers checked their gear. The entrance to Pine Hollow was more remote than she had imagined, tucked behind a thicket of gnarled trees and shielded by a curtain of vines. From a distance, it was easy to see how a cave here could have remained unnoticed for years. Detective Harris was already knee-deep in the planning, pointing to a topographic map laid across the hood of a truck. He explained that the cave's entrance was usually submerged by the creek that wound through the gorge. The unusually dry summer had drawn the waterline back far enough to reveal a rocky opening, just wide enough for a person to slip through. Emily followed the group down a narrow path slick with moss. The air grew cooler as they descended, the sound of rushing water echoing faintly in the distance. When they reached the cave mouth, she was struck by how it seemed to breathe a faint rush of damp air spilling outward, carrying with it the scent of stone and something faintly metallic. The divers went in first, their headlamps cutting thin beams through the dark. Emily stayed just outside, watching as they disappeared one by one into the narrow gap. Minutes stretched into an hour. The only sounds the quiet murmurs of the crew and the occasional splash from inside the cave. When Harris emerged, his wetsuit glistening with cold droplets, he carried something wrapped in a waterproof bag. The material was stained with age, its shape unfamiliar until he set it gently on the ground and unzipped it. Inside was a small canvas satchel, the kind a teacher might carry on a hike. Emily's stomach tightened as she recognized the faded initials stitched into the fabric. They were Claire's. The discovery sent a ripple of quiet through the group. Harris didn't speak right away, only met Emily's eyes with a look that told her this was more than they had expected to find. And as the satchel's contents were revealed piece by piece, the weight of 17 years seemed to press even heavier on the air around them. The satchel lay open on the ground, its contents carefully lifted out and placed onto a clean tarp. Emily knelt beside it, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for a familiar leather-bound notebook. The cover was warped and water-stained, but the brass clasp still held firm. Harris glanced at her, silently asking if she wanted to be the one to open it. She nodded, releasing the catch with a soft click. Inside, the pages were surprisingly intact, though the edges had curled and the ink had bled in places. The first entries were mundane lists of lesson plans, notes about the weather, reminders to pick up supplies for the next field trip. But as Emily turned the pages, the tone shifted. The handwriting grew hurried, the sentences clipped. Claire had written about feeling watched, about hearing footsteps on the trail at night when she believed she was alone. Beneath the notebook was a small roll of film, sealed in a plastic canister. Harris held it up, frowning at the visible signs of water damage. "We'll have to see what can be recovered," he said quietly, tucking it into an evidence bag. Next came a silver whistle on a frayed cord, the kind used by teachers during outdoor activities. The metal was tarnished, but when Emily picked it up, she could still imagine the sharp, piercing sound it would have made cutting through the forest air. The final item was a folded map, the paper stiff and brittle from years in damp conditions. Red ink circled a spot deep within the park, far from the marked trails. Scrawled in the margin were the words, "Must check before sunset," in Claire's careful hand. Emily traced the circle with her fingertip, wondering what could have drawn her there on that day. The crew worked in silence, as Harris packed the items away. The air felt heavier now, the forest around them unnervingly quiet, as though it too was holding its breath. Emily could not shake the thought that these objects had been hidden here deliberately, preserved not by chance, but by someone's intent. And as she glanced once more at the map's cryptic markings, she knew this was only the beginning of finding out where Claire had gone and why she had never come back. The walk back to the ranger station was quiet, the forest damp with the lingering smell of rain. Emily kept her eyes on the evidence bag Harris carried, the outline of the camera just visible through the cloudy plastic. It had been sealed for so long in that dark place that she almost felt it might resist the light once it was brought into the open. Every step seemed to echo with the weight of what they might uncover. Inside the station, Harris cleared a work table and laid the bag down gently, as though it might shatter with the wrong touch. The air felt still, heavy with anticipation. Emily sat across from him, her hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The lens of the camera was cracked, and a thin line of rust traced the metal edges, but the shutter button still clicked when pressed. Harris glanced at her before removing the film canister with careful precision. They could not develop the film here, so Harris made a call to the lab in the nearest city, arranging for a courier to pick it up. Emily watched the camera being sealed again, knowing it would be hours before any images came back. The waiting felt unbearable. She tried to busy herself by reading through old case files, flipping past reports that offered no answers, only speculation. There were interviews with students who had been on that trip, notes from park rangers who had searched the area for weeks, and statements from locals who claimed to have seen someone matching Claire's description near the park road days after she disappeared. One page caught Emily's attention, a report from a hiker, dated 3 weeks after Claire vanished. He had described hearing a whistle somewhere off the trail at dusk, sharp and insistent, before it cut off suddenly. He had assumed it was from a search team, but no patrols had been in that area at the time. Emily set the page aside, her mind circling back to the whistle found in the satchel. It was a detail too strange to ignore. She felt an unease she could not quite name, as though the past was pressing in on the present, carrying with it the faint echo of that sound. Whatever the film revealed, she knew it would be only the first step toward a truth that had been hidden for far too long. The call from the lab came just after sunset, the sky outside the ranger station painted in fading streaks of rose and violet. Harris answered on the first ring, his voice low, measured. Emily could not hear the words on the other end, only the pause, the faint hum of static, and the tightening of his jaw. He hung up slowly and looked at her with a seriousness that made her heart quicken. The film had developed, and the images were unusual. They were ready for viewing. The drive into the city felt longer than it should have, the winding road through the pines stretching endlessly. Emily sat in the passenger seat, her mind replaying what little she remembered of that trip in 1982. She had been just a freshman teacher then, assigned to another school in the district. She never met Claire, but knew of her through the stories told by other educators. Claire had been the kind of teacher who stayed late for students who needed extra help, who took her camera everywhere, capturing moments no one else thought to preserve. When they arrived at the lab, the technician met them with a slim envelope. He did not speak much, only handed it over with a look that suggested he had questions of his own. Harris pulled out the glossy prints and spread them across a light table. Emily leaned in, her breath catching. The first few frames were what one might expect students smiling on the trail, the jagged outline of the cliffs in the distance, the sunlight scattering through leaves. But then the images shifted. The last sequence showed the entrance to a cave, its mouth framed in shadow. Claire must have been holding the camera at arm's length, the beam of her flashlight cutting a narrow path into the darkness. The final image was blurred, the light catching on what looked like a figure just beyond the edge of the beam. The shape was human, but the face was indistinct, as if turned at the last second. Emily felt a chill work its way down her spine. These were not just mementos of a field trip, they were a breadcrumb trail into Claire's final moments. Harris slid the last photo back into the envelope with care, his voice quiet when he finally spoke. They needed to find that cave again, no matter what was waiting inside. Morning light spilled across the ranger station as Emily spread a map across the desk, its creases worn soft from years of use. Harris leaned over her shoulder, tracing a finger along the ridgeline that bordered the state park. The cave from the photographs was not marked, but the terrain was familiar to him. He remembered a section of rock face, known for its sinkholes and narrow fissures, places hikers avoided because they were easy to get lost in. Emily studied the photographs again, noting the way the sunlight had fallen in the earlier shots. The direction of the shadows told her Claire must have approached the cave from the east. In the final blurred image, the beam of the flashlight cut left, suggesting the entrance was angled against the hillside. It was small details like these that might be the difference between wandering aimlessly and finding the place. They loaded supplies into Harris's truck, the gear heavier than Emily expected. She had agreed to go because she could not ignore the pull of the mystery, the sense that they were walking a path Claire had left for them to follow. As they drove toward the trailhead, the pines closed in around the road, their scent sharp in the cool air. The hike began easily enough. The trail, a narrow ribbon, through ferns and low shrubs. But as they climbed, the ground grew steeper, the rocks slick from a recent rain. Emily's boots slipped more than once, and Harris offered his hand without a word. It was when they reached a split in the trail that he stopped, pulling the photograph from his jacket. He turned it slowly until the jagged cliff face in the background matched what they saw before them. Leaving the main trail, they pushed through underbrush, the ground crunching with fallen twigs and leaves. Then, in the silence between steps, Emily heard a faint drip of water echoing somewhere ahead. They moved toward the sound until the trees opened into a clearing, and there it was. The cave's mouth yawned before them, exactly as it appeared in Claire's final photographs. The shadows inside were thick, swallowing the morning light. Emily felt her pulse quicken, knowing they were about to step into the same darkness that had once taken Claire. The air shifted as Emily stepped closer to the cave's entrance, the temperature dropping with a dampness that clung to her skin. Harris adjusted his headlamp, the beam slicing through the darkness and catching on jagged edges of stone. The ground at the threshold was uneven, littered with small rocks that had tumbled from the ceiling over time. Emily hesitated, her eyes tracing the curve of the opening, imagining Claire standing in the same spot all those years ago. They ducked inside, their footsteps muffled by the soft crunch of gravel. The deeper they went, the more the outside world seemed to fade, the sounds of wind and distant birds replaced by the steady drip of water echoing from somewhere unseen. Emily's lamp revealed glistening walls where moisture clung, the surfaces rippled and warped by centuries of slow erosion. The narrow passage forced them to walk single file, their shoulders brushing against the cold stone. After a few minutes, the tunnel widened into a small chamber. The ceiling arched high overhead, and stalactites hung like teeth, their tips glistening in the pale light. Harris pointed toward the ground, where an old length of rope lay half buried in silt. The fibers were frayed, but still intact enough to suggest it had been there for years. Emily knelt, brushing away the damp grit, and found a rusted carabiner still clipped to the end. She glanced at Harris, both knowing it might have been Claire's. They pressed on, the passage narrowing again, the sound of water growing louder. The floor dipped into a shallow pool, forcing them to step carefully along its edge. The water was so clear that Emily could see the pebbles beneath its surface, each one smoothed by time. As they rounded a sharp bend, the light from their lamps caught something ahead. At first it looked like debris, tangled among a cluster of rocks near the wall. But as Emily stepped closer, her breath caught. A faded piece of fabric was lodged between two stones, its pattern barely visible under a layer of dust and mineral deposits. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and freed it from the rock. It was a strip of floral cloth, the kind often sewn into the lining of jackets in the early 80s. Emily held it up, the beam of her headlamp bringing the colors back to life. It was delicate, fragile from years underground, yet unmistakably human, and in that moment the cave no longer felt empty. Emily stood frozen, the scrap of floral cloth still in her hand, its damp threads clinging to her fingers. Harris shifted beside her, his light sweeping slowly across the chamber as though searching for something the darkness had kept hidden for nearly 2 decades. The smell of damp stone mixed with the faint metallic tang of minerals in the air, and somewhere deeper in the cave, the steady plink of dripping water echoed like a metronome. She thought about how that fabric might have ended up here. Had it torn during a fall? Was Claire alive when she left it behind? Or had it been left as some desperate signal for help that no one ever found? The weight of the questions pressed against her chest as she carefully tucked the cloth into a small evidence pouch. They moved deeper into the chamber, each step deliberate, their voices barely above a whisper. The ground was slick, forcing them to brace against the walls for balance. Harris stopped suddenly, raising a hand for Emily to halt. His light had caught on something in the shadows just ahead. Resting against the far wall, half buried under a thin layer of silt and calcified deposits, was a battered metal canteen. Its once bright surface had dulled to a mottled gray, but a faint engraving was still visible near the rim initials, worn but legible enough to read. Emily crouched down, her breath fogging in the cooler air, and traced the letters with her glove. They matched Claire's. Her pulse quickened, but so did the unease twisting in her gut. If Claire had been in this chamber, why had no one found her? And how far had she ventured before whatever happened? The chamber's ceiling funneled into a narrow crevice beyond the canteen, the opening barely large enough for a person to squeeze through. Harris crouched, shining his beam into the black void beyond, but the light seemed to vanish before reaching any walls. The sound of dripping water was louder now, accompanied by an occasional hollow splash. Emily stared at that narrow opening, her mind pulling at threads of possibility she wasn't sure she wanted to unravel. The evidence they had found, cloth, rope, canteen, suggested Claire had come far deeper into this place than anyone had guessed. And, somewhere ahead, in the unreachable dark, the truth felt close enough to touch. The air in the cave shifted as Emily eased herself toward the narrow opening, her boots scraping softly over the slick rock. Harris remained just behind her, his flashlight beam grazing the jagged edges of the passage. The space was tight enough that Emily had to turn her shoulders sideways to slip through, the stone cold against her jacket. Every breath echoed, and the sound of dripping water seemed to grow louder, like a slow countdown. When she emerged on the other side, the space opened into a small domed chamber. The beam of her light swept across the walls, revealing streaks of mineral deposits glistening like wet glass. But what caught her attention was the uneven mound near the center, partly hidden under a sheet of collapsed rock. She stepped closer, her boots crunching over grit, and realized it wasn't just rubble. Tangled among the debris was an old canvas satchel, its strap frayed and stiff with age. Emily knelt and brushed away the loose sediment. The satchel's leather buckle resisted her pull, but it gave way with a brittle snap. Inside, the contents were clumped together by moisture and time. A spiral notebook, the edges warped and pages stuck, rested on top. Beneath it, something metallic caught the light. She drew it out slowly, a small key attached to a brass tag, the numbers faint but still visible. Harris crouched beside her, his face tightening as he read them. It was a storage locker number, one that had been logged in Claire's missing persons file, but never linked to any recovered property. They exchanged a glance, both knowing this was more than coincidence. Emily's fingers lingered on the cold brass, wondering if the locker had ever been opened, or if its contents had been waiting in silence for all these years. The satchel still had weight to it, so she reached in again, pulling out a thin tin box. Its lid was dented, and the metal groaned as she pried it open. Inside, wrapped in brittle wax paper, were several undeveloped rolls of film, the labels faded but intact. Emily's breath caught. Film could hold answers. Film could hold the last moments Claire had been alive. She closed the tin carefully, aware of the fragile thread of history in her hands. Somewhere above ground, in the daylight, these rolls could speak, but in the cold cave, they felt like whispers sealed in stone. The rain had tapered off by the time Emily and Harris emerged from the cave, but the sky was still heavy with clouds, muting the daylight into a dull gray wash. The satchel was strapped to Emily's pack now, its damp weight pressing against her spine with every step down the trail. They spoke little, the sound of wet gravel underfoot replacing conversation, but the unspoken urgency hung between them. Every instinct told Emily that what they had found had been hidden with intent, and that whoever placed it there had never expected it to be discovered. Back at the ranger station, Harris cleared a work table while Emily set the satchel down. They decided not to risk damaging anything further, especially the film rolls, and instead logged each item meticulously before placing them into separate evidence bags. The brass key drew particular attention. Its tag was worn almost smooth, but Harris traced the stamped numbers with his finger as though committing them to memory. He disappeared into the back office to cross-check the number against old property records, leaving Emily alone with the tin of film. She turned it over in her hands, the cold metal biting her skin. The labels, though faded, were marked with dates that corresponded to the spring of 1982. That was the same semester Claire had taken her class to these foothills for the fateful field trip. Emily pictured her then, sunlight in her hair, camera strap around her neck, guiding a line of students through the rocks and trees. The thought made her chest tighten. These rolls might have captured moments no one had seen since that day. Harris returned with a printout, his expression unreadable. The key belonged to a storage unit in a small town 50 miles north, rented under a name no one had ever connected to Claire. The rental had been paid for nearly 3 years after her disappearance, then abruptly abandoned. The unit had never been claimed or cleared. Emily felt a chill despite the stale warmth of the station. Whoever had kept that unit had a reason, and she doubted it was an innocent one. She slipped the tin of film into her bag, aware that time could be as much an enemy as it was an ally. The answers might still be waiting, but with every step forward, the shadows of 1982 seemed to stretch longer, reaching for the present. The storage facility sat on the edge of town, its rows of corrugated metal doors faded from years of sun and wind. A thin mist clung to the ground, curling around Emily's boots as she followed Harris toward the unit number from the record. The padlock was rusted but intact, a reminder that no one had been inside for over a decade. Harris worked the bolt cutters without a word, the sharp snap echoing through the quiet lot, and together they rolled the door upward. The smell hit them first, a dry, musty air that carried the weight of years sealed away. Inside, stacks of cardboard boxes leaned precariously, their corners darkened with dust. An old wooden trunk sat against the back wall, its brass latches dulled with tarnish. Emily felt her pulse quicken as she stepped inside, brushing her fingers across the lid of the trunk before kneeling to open it. Inside, wrapped in yellowed newspaper, was a collection of personal items. A neatly folded cardigan that matched one seen in photographs of Claire, a canvas tote with faded school logos, and beneath them, a leather-bound journal. Emily lifted it carefully, its spine cracked from age, and flipped to the first page. The handwriting was unmistakable, slanted, looping letters that matched notes Claire had written in the margins of student assignments. The entries began months before the field trip, recounting daily lessons, student progress, and personal reflections. But as Emily turned the pages, the tone shifted. Claire wrote about feeling watched on her walks home, about receiving letters with no return address, and about an uneasy presence lingering near the schoolyard. The last entry stopped mid-sentence, dated the day before the trip. In the far corner of the trunk, tucked beneath the journal, Emily found a small envelope. Inside was a strip of undeveloped negatives, the edges brittle with age. She held them to the light spilling through the open door, but the images were faint and unclear. Still, the shapes were enough to make her uneasy figures in the distance, a man's profile partially obscured by shadow and the silhouette of what looked like the mouth of a cave. Emily closed the journal, the weight of it in her hands almost too much to bear. They had come looking for answers, but what they found was a trail that seemed to run darker and deeper than she had imagined. The small photography shop smelled faintly of chemicals and dust, a place frozen in time with its glass counter displays and racks of film canisters long past their prime. The owner, a wiry man with silver hair and steady hands, looked up as Emily and Harris entered. He had developed film for half the town in the 80s, and when Emily explained what they had found in the trunk, his expression shifted from polite curiosity to something far more serious. He led them into the dim back room, where an old enlarger sat beneath a red safety light. Emily placed the brittle strip of negatives on the counter. The man handled them as if they were made of spun glass, his eyes narrowing as he examined the faint, ghostly images. He said the film was degraded but not beyond saving, and with some careful work he could bring the photographs back to life. As the images slowly emerged in the developer trays, the silence in the room grew heavy. The first photo showed a rocky trail cutting through dense woodland, familiar from maps of the area Claire's class had visited. The second frame caught Emily off guard, a blurred but unmistakable image of Claire herself, hair pulled back, smiling faintly toward the camera, though the background seemed strangely out of focus. The third photograph made the hair at the back of Emily's neck rise. It showed the dark mouth of a cave, framed by jagged stone, with a figure standing just inside. The man's features were obscured by shadow, but his posture suggested he was watching. The final image was the most disturbing. It appeared to have been taken in haste, tilted and grainy, but in the corner was a small cluster of children, their faces indistinct yet tense, as if frozen mid-movement. Emily could almost feel the urgency in the way the camera had captured them, the frame cutting off before showing what lay beyond. When the owner placed the damp photographs on the drying rack, Emily found herself staring at them, the red light casting them in an eerie glow. Each picture was a breadcrumb, a glimpse into Claire's final hours, and none of them explained why her camera had ended up deep in a cave or how it had survived untouched for so long. What they did offer, however, was proof that someone else had been there, watching and waiting, long before the day was over. Emily left the shop clutching the envelope of freshly developed photographs, her mind still reeling from the images. The winter air bit at her cheeks as she walked down the quiet main street, the sound of her boots crunching on old patches of snow echoing in her ears. Harris followed a few steps behind, his hands in his coat pockets, his expression unreadable. Neither spoke until they reached the car. Inside, the photographs felt heavier than paper should, as though they carried the weight of every question that had gone unanswered for nearly 2 decades. Emily spread them out on the dashboard, studying each one in the fading daylight. The cave's entrance was unmistakable, even with the film's grain. Harris leaned in, pointing to a faint marking on the rock near the figure in the shadows. It looked like an etching, perhaps a letter or symbol, carved deliberately into the stone. They drove out of town toward the old parkland where Claire's class had taken their ill-fated field trip. The narrow road wound through skeletal trees, their bare branches rattling in the wind like dry bones. When they reached the ranger station, an older man in a green jacket was waiting, his face etched with the kind of lines that come from years spent outdoors. He remembered the 1982 disappearance all too well. As soon as he saw the cave photo, he sighed, saying it matched a location locals called Black Hollow, a place avoided by most hikers due to dangerous drop-offs and the stories that clung to it. The ranger hesitated before adding that the cave was off-trail and hard to reach, especially in winter. But when Emily told him about the marking, his expression darkened. He said there had been rumors of strange symbols found near old mining shafts in that area, some dating back decades, though no official explanation was ever given. By the time they left the station, the sun had dropped low, bleeding orange light through the trees. The photographs lay on the seat between them, and Emily felt a quiet urgency building inside her. Somewhere out there, past the frost-bitten woods and into the stone belly of Black Hollow, was the last place Claire had been seen alive. And now, for the first time, Emily had more than just memories and unanswered questions. She had a direction. The following morning, the forest was shrouded in a pale mist that clung to the ground like it was reluctant to let go. Emily and Harris set out early, their breath curling in the cold air as they followed the ranger's directions toward Black Hollow. The trail was narrow, littered with frozen leaves and patches of ice that made each step deliberate. The deeper they went, the quieter it became, until even the distant hum of the town had faded into nothing but the crunch of their boots and the occasional snap of a twig. After nearly an hour, the path ended abruptly at a wall of rock streaked with frost. Harris scanned the terrain and spotted a faint, overgrown path curling along the base of the cliff. It was treacherous, the kind of route that would have been nearly invisible to anyone not looking for it. Emily's hand brushed against the cold stone as they followed it, the air growing noticeably cooler with each step. The shadows deepened until the outline of the cave finally appeared ahead of them, a dark wound in the cliffside. They paused at the entrance, the scent of damp earth and mineral-heavy water drifting out to meet them. Harris shone a flashlight into the darkness, its beam cutting through the mist that hung just inside. Emily stepped forward, her pulse quickening. She could almost picture Claire standing here years ago, her students nearby, the day still full of laughter before it had all gone wrong. Inside, the cave opened into a chamber littered with small stones and shallow pools. The beam of the flashlight slid across the wall until it caught something, a faint carving, just as in the photograph. Up close, Emily could see it was more than a random scratch. It was a deliberate mark, shaped like an angular letter or rune. Her fingers traced it, the cold biting into her skin, and a strange unease settled over her. They found no other signs of Claire that day, but standing in that silent chamber, Emily felt certain this was not the end. The cave was holding its secrets tightly, as if waiting for someone willing to dig deeper, and she knew she was not leaving without finding out what they were. Emily returned to the cave the next afternoon with a heavier pack and a firmer resolve. The weather had shifted overnight, bringing a cold drizzle that left her jacket damp and the trail slick underfoot. By the time she reached the cliff, the mist had thickened, curling around the rocks like smoke and making the entrance appear even darker. Harris was already there, waiting with 2 extra lanterns and a coil of rope slung over his shoulder. He did not speak much, only gave her a look that said he understood why she had come back. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of wet stone. They moved slowly, their light sweeping over every crevice and shadow. Emily felt the uneven ground under her boots and the distant drip of water echoing through the chamber. She returned to the carved symbol and studied it again, now noticing that a narrow crack ran from its base toward the floor. Harris crouched down, pressing his hand against the rock, and felt a faint draft seeping through. They began to clear the small stones and debris away, revealing a tighter passage behind. The space was just wide enough for a person to slip through sideways. Harris went first, his lantern bobbing ahead, and Emily followed, her shoulders brushing against the damp stone. The passage opened into a smaller chamber, one the rangers had likely never found. The air here was cooler, still, almost untouched. Against one wall sat a pile of objects softened by age, a torn piece of canvas, what looked like the rusted frame of a small folding chair, and a leather strap so worn it was barely holding together. Emily knelt and brushed away a layer of silt, revealing the corner of something solid and dark. When she pulled it free, her breath caught. It was a small metal case, its hinges stiff with corrosion. She did not open it then, not in that damp silence. Instead, she slipped it into her pack, feeling its unexpected weight press against her spine. As they made their way back toward the main chamber, Emily could not shake the sense that they had just crossed the threshold into the heart of the mystery. Whatever was inside that case might finally speak for Claire after 17 years of silence. The rain had grown heavier by the time Emily reached her cabin that night, the sound of it drumming against the roof as she set the metal case on the table. A single lamp cast a warm but narrow glow, leaving the corners of the room in shadow. She sat for a moment, her hands resting on the cold surface, feeling the ridges of rust under her fingertips. The latch was stiff, resisting her first attempt, but with a firm twist it gave way, the lid creaking open on hinges reluctant from years of disuse. Inside, everything was wrapped in layers of waxed paper that had gone brittle and yellowed with age. Emily peeled it back carefully, revealing a bundle of photographs tied with frayed string. The images were damp along the edges, but mostly intact, and as she shuffled through them, her breath slowed. They showed the students from that 1982 trip laughing on a trail, squinting against the sun, sitting in front of the cave entrance before it was overgrown. In several shots, Claire appeared, smiling faintly, always turned slightly away from the lens, as if distracted by something just out of frame. Beneath the photographs was a small notebook. Its cover was softened with wear, and the first pages were filled with neat, deliberate handwriting. The early entries spoke of lesson plans, student behavior, and the challenges of keeping order during an overnight field trip. But as the pages went on, the tone shifted. Claire wrote about feeling watched, about hearing voices late at night when the rest of the group was asleep, and about a local man who had visited the site claiming knowledge of the cave's deeper passages. Her last entry was dated the morning she disappeared. It ended mid-sentence. Emily sat back, the weight of it all settling heavily. This was not just a random collection of lost items. It was a record of Claire's final days, perhaps even her final hours, preserved in the cold dark of that hidden chamber. The storm outside rattled the window, and she felt the urgency sharpen in her chest. The photographs, the journal, and the cave itself were telling a story that had been buried for nearly 2 decades, and now it was up to her to follow it to its end. Emily woke before dawn, her mind still caught in the grip of the images she had seen the night before. The photographs and the journal had left her restless, haunted by the last traces of Claire's life. She packed them carefully into a dry bag, along with the camera that had started this whole chain of events, and set out toward the cave once more. The forest was quiet, the air heavy with the smell of damp earth, as if it too was holding its breath. When she reached the mouth of the cave, the morning light barely reached inside, only brushing the edges of the stone. She switched on her headlamp, the beam cutting a narrow path through the darkness. Her steps echoed softly, the sound swallowed quickly by the still air. She followed the same route as before, past the chamber where she had found the camera, deeper into passages that seemed untouched for decades. The walls here were slick and cold, and she could feel the temperature dropping with each step. She stopped when she saw it. A faint marking on the wall, just above eye level, barely visible unless the light hit it at the right angle. It was a carved initial, the C faint but unmistakable. Beneath it, in smaller scratches, was a date, May 15, 1982. Her breath caught. That was the day Claire vanished. She reached out and brushed her fingers over the letters, the stone cold and unyielding beneath her touch. Nearby, she found a narrow tunnel partially blocked by a fallen slab of rock. The edges were sharp and fractured, as if it had given way suddenly. She crouched down and peered through the gap. On the other side, her light revealed what looked like a small chamber, the floor littered with debris. Something about the space felt untouched, a pocket of time, sealed off since that spring day. Emily's heart was pounding. She knew she could not move the rock alone, but she also knew this was no dead end. Claire had been here. The markings, the tunnel, and the stillness of that hidden chamber all pointed to a moment frozen in time, waiting to be uncovered. She turned back toward the entrance, her resolve hardening. Whatever lay beyond that barrier was the next piece of the story, and she was not going to leave it buried any longer. The following afternoon, Emily returned to the cave with 2 local search and rescue volunteers who had agreed to help her. Both men carried compact pry bars and climbing gear, their expressions focused but curious as she led them to the narrow tunnel. The air grew colder, the deeper they went, until the warmth of the outside world felt like a memory. When they reached the fallen slab, the men exchanged a glance and began their work. The sound of metal scraping against rock echoed in the confined space, punctuated by the occasional crack of stone giving way. Dust hung in the air, swirling in the beams of their headlamps. Emily stood back, clutching the dry bag with the camera and journal, her pulse quickening with each inch the opening widened. After nearly an hour, the slab shifted enough for them to squeeze through. On the other side, the chamber was smaller than she had imagined, the ceiling low and uneven. The light swept across the floor, revealing a scattering of rusted metal, scraps of fabric, and something that made Emily's breath catch. Near the back wall lay a leather satchel, its strap twisted and brittle with age. She stepped forward slowly, her knees almost buckling as she knelt beside it. The satchel's flap was stiff but still intact. Inside, she found a small stack of papers, folded neatly, and a compact mirror with a cracked face. The initials CH were engraved on its back. One of the volunteers pointed to the corner where the rock wall curved inward. There, half hidden beneath a layer of silt and dust, was a thermos. Emily reached for it, brushing away the grime. It was dented but still sealed, its paint chipped to reveal metal beneath. She imagined Claire sitting here, using it to keep warm on that day in 1982, never knowing it would be the last object she touched that someone would find. The chamber was silent except for the sound of their breathing. No one spoke. The air felt thick with the weight of a story that had been waiting nearly 2 decades to be told. Emily cradled the satchel against her chest, the leather cold but somehow comforting. They had found more than objects. They had found her presence, preserved in this hidden pocket of the earth, and Emily knew this was only the beginning of what the cave was ready to reveal. Back in town, Emily laid the satchel, thermos, and cracked mirror on the long wooden table in the Historical Society's back room. The air smelled faintly of dust and varnish, and the old ceiling fan hummed above her. Across from her sat Helen Burke, the retired school secretary who had been on that 1982 field trip. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the satchel, brushing her fingertips along the worn leather like she was afraid it might vanish if she pressed too hard. "I remember this," Helen whispered, her voice thin but steady. Claire never went anywhere without it. She used to keep lesson plans in here and little slips of paper with quotes she loved. She unfastened the flap, peering inside at the folded pages. Her eyes softened when she saw the compact mirror. Her sister gave her this when she got the teaching job. Claire used to check her hair in it before class, always laughing at herself. Emily leaned in, sensing that these artifacts were not just objects, but touchstones to a life frozen in time. She asked Helen to tell her about the day of the field trip, and Helen recounted it slowly, the way a person walks over fragile ground. She spoke of how Claire had led her group toward the cave entrance after lunch, how she seemed distracted, glancing toward the ridge as though she had heard something. Helen remembered calling after her, but by the time she caught up, Claire had already vanished from sight. The two sat in silence for a moment, the gravity of the memory settling between them. Emily thought of the camera, still waiting to be developed, and wondered what its final images might reveal. Were they ordinary snapshots of students and scenery, or something else entirely, something that explained why she had entered that cave alone? Helen's eyes lingered on the thermos before she spoke again. "We searched for days. The caves were too dangerous for the children, so the police took over, but nothing Not one clue, until now. Emily felt the pull of the cave more than ever, as if it still held pieces of Claire's story beneath its cold stone skin. She knew they had found fragments, but the truth was still buried, waiting for someone willing to dig deeper. The photographs emerged from the developer tray like ghosts surfacing from dark water. Emily stood over the basin in the dim light of the small-town photo lab, the air heavy with the sharp scent of chemicals. Each image appeared in slow, patient strokes, the outlines filling in until the moment captured decades ago stared back at her. The first few frames were ordinary enough. Claire smiling with a group of students in front of the bus. A close-up of a wildflower pressed between her fingers. The entrance to the limestone cave, its mouth yawning in shadow. But then the tone shifted. One frame showed Claire alone, standing inside the cave, the sunlight behind her casting her face into half-darkness. She was looking at something out of frame, her expression wary. Emily gently lifted each photograph, placing them in a row on the drying line. The next image made her pause. It was blurry, as if taken in haste, but a figure was visible tall, looming at the cave's edge, his features indistinct, but his posture fixed on Claire. A rush of unease passed through her. The final photograph was the most haunting of all. It showed the narrow passage deep inside the cave, the beam of a flashlight cutting through the black. At the far end, just before the frame vanished into darkness, there was the faint outline of a hand pressed against the rock. Emily stood there, her heart heavy, realizing these might be the last moments anyone saw of Claire. The pictures were more than memories. They were a timeline, a breadcrumb trail that spoke without words. She placed them back into their protective sleeves, careful not to smudge the decades-old emulsion. Questions pressed hard against her thoughts. Who was the man? Why had she gone into the cave with him? And why had the camera been left behind, hidden until a chance discovery brought it into the light? As she locked the photographs in her bag, Emily knew these images would not stay in the darkroom for long. They would have to be shown, shared with those who had waited years for answers. But she also understood that what they revealed might fracture the quiet acceptance some in town had clung to for nearly 2 decades. The photographs were laid out across the kitchen table, their edges curling slightly as if resisting the touch of fresh air. Sheriff Dawson leaned over them, his weathered hands braced against the wood. His gaze moved slowly from one image to the next, his jaw tightening at the sight of the man's shadowed figure. Emily sat across from him, watching his reaction closely, the low hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. "This isn't just some hiker who stumbled into the cave," Dawson said finally, his voice low. He knew she was there. His finger hovered over the blurred frame, tracing the outline of the figure. "And if I'm right about who this is, we may be reopening more than just Claire's case." Emily could feel the weight of the moment pressing in. She thought about the names that had been whispered over the years, the unspoken suspicions that never found enough proof to break into the open. She remembered the way older townsfolk's eyes would drift away whenever Claire's disappearance was mentioned, as if looking too long at the truth might summon it. Dawson's deputy stepped forward with a faded manila folder. Inside were old witness statements from 1982, some written in rushed, uneven script by teenagers who had been on that field trip. Several of them mentioned a man seen near the caves the day before the students arrived. No one could agree on his name, but the descriptions shared unsettling similarities. Emily reached for one of the photographs, holding it up so the kitchen light fell just right across the image. The blur did little to hide the man's build or the tilt of his shoulders. It was enough to stir recognition in Dawson's eyes. He didn't say the name aloud, not yet, but she could see it forming in his mind. The room felt smaller now, the air thick with the sense that they were on the edge of pulling at a thread that could unravel years of silence. Dawson closed the folder, his voice quiet but steady. "We'll bring these to the lab. If we're lucky, we'll match him." And then he let the sentence fade, leaving only the sound of the wind moving through the trees outside, as if the night itself was listening. The trial drew the town's attention in a way nothing had in decades. Faces that had grown older since 1982 filled the courtroom, each person carrying their own memory of Claire Hartman and the day she vanished. Emily sat in the front row, the camera photographs carefully stored in an evidence box at her feet. The man in the defendant's chair avoided her gaze, his eyes fixed on some point far beyond the wooden walls. Testimony unfolded like pieces of a puzzle finally clicking together. Former students recounted the field trip in halting voices, their recollections sharpened by the knowledge that someone had been watching them from the shadows. Experts spoke about the camera, how the film had survived in the cold darkness of the cave, sealing away moments that would one day speak louder than words. The grainy image of the man's figure, matched to a much younger version of the accused, had been enough to reopen the investigation and, ultimately, to bring him here. When the verdict was read, a hush swept the room. Guilty! The word seemed to echo off the paneled walls, heavier than the gavel that followed it. Emily felt an ache that was not relief exactly, but something close a release of a question that had hung in the air for 17 years. Afterward, she drove to the overlook above the caves, the same place where Claire had last been seen alive. The sea below was restless, the waves colliding against the cliffs with a steady, timeless rhythm. Emily took the camera from her bag and held it for a long moment, the metal cool against her palms. She thought of Claire's final moments, of the students she had shepherded with such care, and of the injustice that had stolen her life. She set the camera down on the stone ledge, not as an offering, but as a quiet acknowledgement of what had been found and what could never be returned. The wind carried the scent of salt and distant rain, and for the first time, Emily allowed herself to believe the story could rest. Somewhere behind the veil of years, Claire Hartman's voice felt closer, no longer lost in the cave's silence but carried forward in the light.